On a clear night, far from city lights, the sky above you contains more stars than you could count in several lifetimes. Astronomers estimate there are somewhere between 200 and 400 billion stars in our galaxy alone. And our galaxy is one of roughly 2 trillion galaxies in the observable universe. That is a number that the human mind cannot genuinely hold. It's too large, it dissolves before you can fully grasp it. And yet, somewhere in the middle of all that immensity, on a small rocky planet orbiting an unremarkable star near the edge of one of those 2 trillion galaxies, people have spent thousands of years looking up and asking a very simple question. Are we alone? Not as a scientific inquiry at first, just as a feeling, a late night suspicion. The particular kind of wonder that arrives when everything is quiet and the sky is very large and you are, in that moment, very small. That question has never been answered, and, in the absence of an answer, something remarkable has happened. An entire landscape of stories, theories, sightings, documents, testimonies, and possibilities has grown up around that question. Built by ordinary people, by military pilots, by scientists, by former government officials, and by researchers who have spent their entire lives following a thread that the official world has, for a long time, preferred not to discuss. Tonight, we're going to walk through that landscape together. We're going to cover the most famous theories: Roswell, Area 51, the Men in Black, the government cover-up. And then we're going to go further into the stranger regions, alien abduction, ancient civilizations, hybridization programs, and the more recent revelations that have come from official sources in the last several years. We'll take our time. There's no urgency here. You don't need to watch the screen. You don't need to keep notes. Just settle in, get comfortable, and let the story unfold at whatever pace your mind wants to receive it. Because this is one of the oldest stories human beings have been telling each other, and it is, whatever else it is, a genuinely fascinating one. Let's start at the beginning. The grounding. To understand the modern alien conspiracy landscape, it helps to understand how we got here, how a question that once belonged to philosophy and religion became, in the middle of the 20th century, a matter of government files and classified briefings and retired military officers giving sworn testimony before congressional committees. Because, for most of human history, the idea of life beyond Earth was not something you could investigate. It was something you imagined. Ancient civilizations looked up at the sky and saw patterns. Constellations became stories. Stories became mythologies. And mythologies became ways of explaining a universe that felt both intimate and impossibly large at the same time. In ancient Greece, philosophers like Epicurus suggested that other worlds might exist, each with their own forms of life. In India, ancient texts describe multiple realms of existence, populated by beings with abilities that did not follow ordinary human limits. In medieval Europe, debates about life beyond Earth were often framed as theological questions, whether God's creation extended beyond our world, or whether humanity occupied a uniquely central position. These were not scientific discussions in the modern sense. They were reflections of curiosity. They were, in a quiet way, early versions of the same question we are still asking. Are we alone? That question remained largely philosophical until technology began to change what was possible to observe. The invention of the telescope in the early 17th century allowed astronomers to see that the moon had mountains and craters, that Jupiter had moons of its own, that the heavens were not smooth and perfect, as had once been believed, but complex and dynamic. By the 19th century, astronomers were mapping the surface of Mars and noting what appeared, through early telescopes, to be straight lines crossing its surface. These lines were called canals, a translation of the Italian word canali, which could also mean channels. But in English, canals carried a different implication. It suggested construction. It suggested intent. It suggested intelligence. The idea that Mars might be inhabited became for a time a serious scientific discussion. Newspapers speculated. Writers imagined civilizations. Observatories dedicated time to studying the planet more closely. Later, with better telescopes, the canals disappeared. They had been optical illusions, artifacts of limited resolution and human pattern recognition. But the idea had already taken hold. By the time H.G. Wells wrote The War of the Worlds in 1898, the notion of intelligent life on other planets was no longer purely speculative. It was culturally embedded. It had become a narrative people recognized. When Orson Welles adapted that story for radio in 1938, presenting it as a series of realistic news bulletins, something interesting happened. Some listeners believed it, not because they were irrational, but because the idea itself had become plausible enough, familiar enough, that it could briefly be mistaken for reality. This is important to understand. By the time 1947 arrived, the human imagination had already prepared itself for the possibility of something in the sky that did not belong there. What changed in 1947 was not the idea. It was the evidence, or at least what appeared to be evidence. The shift happened quickly, and it happened in the summer of 1947. Before that summer, the question of life elsewhere in the universe was largely the domain of science fiction writers and astronomers. After that summer, it became something else. Something closer. Something that, for the first time, seemed to be happening here. The first event came in June. Kenneth Arnold was not looking for anything unusual. He was a businessman. A pilot, yes, but not a trained observer of atmospheric phenomena. He was flying near Mount Rainier on a clear afternoon, scanning the terrain below for a downed military aircraft he had been asked to help locate. And then he saw them. 9 objects, bright, reflective, moving in formation. He watched them for several minutes. He estimated their speed by timing how long they took to pass between 2 mountain peaks. His calculation suggested they were traveling faster than any known aircraft at the time. But it wasn't just their speed. It was the way they moved. He later described their motion as like a saucer if you skip it across water. That comparison, casual, almost offhand, would become one of the most influential phrases in modern folklore. Because when journalists reported the story, they did not describe the motion, they described the shape. Flying saucers. The phrase spread almost instantly. Within days, newspapers across the United States were printing reports of similar sightings. People began looking up more often. And when people look up with expectation, they tend to see more. Some of the sightings were likely misidentified aircraft. Some were weather phenomena. Some were probably hoaxes. But not all of them could be easily explained. And that ambiguity was enough. Because ambiguity invites interpretation. And interpretation, once it begins, rarely moves in only one direction. The second event came just weeks later, early July, Roswell, New Mexico, a place that, until that moment, was not particularly well known outside military circles. But what happened there, or what was said to have happened there, would echo for decades. The rancher, Mac Brazel, did not initially treat the debris he found as extraordinary. It was unusual, scattered across a wide area. Thin, metallic-looking material, lightweight, difficult to tear or damage. But unusual things are found in rural landscapes all the time. It was only after he heard reports of flying discs in the news that he began to wonder whether what he had found might be connected. That moment, the alignment between personal observation and a newly introduced idea, is where many stories begin. He reported it. The sheriff reported it. The military arrived, and then something happened that is still, even now, difficult to fully explain in terms of ordinary communication behavior. The Army Air Force announced they had recovered a flying disc. Not debris, not an unidentified object, a flying disc. That phrase carried meaning. It suggested confirmation. It suggested that whatever people had been seeing in the sky now had physical form on the ground. And then, very quickly, that meaning was withdrawn. The next day, the debris was presented as a weather balloon. Photographs were taken. Officers stood beside the material. The story was reframed. Officially, nothing unusual had happened. And yet, something about that sequence, the initial confirmation followed by rapid correction, created a kind of narrative tension that never fully resolved. Because people tend to remember first impressions. And the first impression was not weather balloon. It was something else. From that moment forward, two parallel stories began to develop. One official, one unofficial. The official story was simple, consistent, and gradually expanded with additional detail over the decades. The unofficial story was complex, evolving, and driven largely by testimony. These two stories did not cancel each other out. They coexisted, and in that coexistence, a new kind of conversation emerged. One that depended not just on evidence, but on trust. The cultural context of 1947 matters here, because this was not a calm, stable time. World War II had ended recently, but its effects were still present everywhere. Cities had been destroyed, entire populations displaced. Nuclear weapons had been used for the first time in history, and now a new kind of tension was building. The Cold War, a conflict defined not by open battle, but by secrecy, intelligence, and the constant awareness that information itself could be as powerful as any weapon. Governments became more secretive. Military projects became more classified. And the public, aware that much of what mattered most was happening behind closed doors, began to develop a different relationship with official information. Skepticism increased, not irrational skepticism, contextual skepticism, because it had become clear that not everything could be openly discussed. In that environment, the idea that something significant could be concealed, even something extraordinary, did not feel impossible. It felt consistent. And this is where the feedback loop begins. The government conceals real projects. The public becomes aware of this pattern. The government denies involvement in something unusual. The denial resembles previous denials. The public interprets the denial through that lens. Trust becomes more complicated. And once trust becomes complicated, every new piece of information must be evaluated not just on its own merits, but in relation to a broader pattern of belief. Over the following decades, this pattern deepened. The United States Air Force conducted multiple official investigations into UFO sightings. Project Sign, Project Grudge, and most notably, Project Blue Book, which ran from 1952 to 1969. Thousands of cases were collected. Most were explained, some were not. The official conclusion when Project Blue Book was closed was that UFOs did not pose a threat to national security and did not represent evidence of extraterrestrial technology. But the fact that the investigations had taken place at all was significant, because it confirmed that the phenomenon, whatever it was, had been taken seriously enough to warrant systematic study. At the same time, civilian research organizations began to form. Groups dedicated to collecting reports, interviewing witnesses, and preserving information that they believed might otherwise be lost. Some of these researchers approached the subject cautiously. Others approached it with strong pre-existing beliefs. And as often happens in fields where definitive evidence is scarce, the line between investigation and interpretation became increasingly blurred. Documents began to circulate. Some were authentic. Declassified memos, internal communications, reports that had once been restricted. Others were fabricated, sometimes intentionally, sometimes as misinterpretations of real material, distinguishing between the two required expertise that most people did not have access to. And so the landscape became more complex, more layered, more difficult to navigate with certainty. The terminology evolved alongside the phenomenon. Flying saucer gave way to UFO, a more neutral term that described the observation without implying origin. Later, UAP, unidentified aerial phenomenon, was introduced in official contexts, partly to remove the cultural associations that had accumulated around UFO, and partly to broaden the category beyond objects to include other types of anomalous observations. Language matters, because language shapes how we think about what we are seeing. A flying saucer suggests something constructed. A UFO suggests something unidentified. A phenomenon suggests something not yet understood. Each term carries a slightly different implication. And over time, those implications influence the direction of inquiry. As the decades passed, the range of witnesses expanded. Commercial pilots reported encounters. Military personnel described objects appearing on radar and visually at the same time. Astronauts, in some cases, spoke cautiously about observations they could not fully explain. Intelligence officials began to acknowledge, in limited ways, that the phenomenon existed. This did not produce clarity. It produced accumulation, more reports, more data, more unanswered questions. And then, in the early 21st century, something shifted again. Not suddenly, but noticeably. The conversation, which had long existed at the edges of official discourse, began to move inward. Quietly at first, then more openly. And in 2017, that shift became visible to the general public in a way that was difficult to ignore. The New York Times article did not introduce the phenomenon. It reframed it. It placed it within an official context. It said, in effect, this is being studied, this is being taken seriously. And the accompanying videos, captured by military systems, analyzed by trained personnel, provided something that had often been missing from earlier decades. Consistency, multiple sensors, multiple observers, events recorded in real time, objects moving in ways that did not align with known capabilities, no explanation offered. That combination, official acknowledgement without resolution, is unusual. It does not close a question, it opens it. And once a question is open, it tends to remain that way. Because the absence of an answer is not empty, it is active, it invites thought. It invites speculation. It invites, in a quiet and persistent way, the continuation of a conversation that began long before 1947, but that took on a new and lasting shape in that summer. A conversation that, even now, is still unfolding. Roswell, of all the stories in the alien conspiracy landscape, Roswell is the one everything else orbits around. It sits at the center, not because it is the most detailed case, not because it is the most recent, but because it was the first moment when something unusual, something physical, seemed to intersect directly with official acknowledgement. And then, just as quickly, with official denial, the claim, in its most developed form, is this: In early July of 1947, one or more extraterrestrial spacecraft crashed near Roswell, New Mexico. The United States Army recovered the wreckage and the bodies of the craft's occupants. This recovery was classified at the highest levels. The weather balloon explanation was a deliberate fabrication, and the concealment of what was found has been maintained through various administrations and across more than 7 decades by a succession of people who were instructed never to speak publicly about what they knew. That is the full version. But like most enduring stories, it did not begin in that complete form. It grew, piece by piece, memory by memory, interview by interview. Where does the evidence for this come from? Primarily from people, from testimony, from conversations that often took place many years after the events themselves. The most significant source is a long series of witness testimonies collected over the decades by researchers including Stanton Friedman, who was a nuclear physicist before becoming one of the most dedicated civilian investigators of the Roswell case, and later by authors Kevin Randle and Donald Schmitt. Friedman approached the subject with a particular mindset. He was not, at least initially, trying to prove that extraterrestrials had visited Earth. He was trying to determine whether the official explanation made sense. And in the course of that investigation, he found people who remembered, people who had been there or who believed they had been there. And once those people began to speak, the story began to expand. These testimonies include individuals who claimed to have been present at or near the crash site. Others who said they handled debris that behaved in ways they could not explain. Thin metallic material that could be folded or crumpled and would return to its original shape without creasing. Beams or fragments marked with symbols that did not resemble any known language. Material that was extremely lightweight, yet resistant to cutting, burning, or breaking. Descriptions like these are striking. They are specific, and they tend to remain consistent across different tellings, which is part of why they have endured. There were also accounts, fewer but more dramatic, from individuals who claimed to have seen bodies, small, non-human in appearance, with features that did not match ordinary human proportions. These accounts are more difficult to evaluate. They are less numerous, and they carry a heavier emotional weight, which can sometimes influence how they are remembered and retold. One of the most discussed witnesses was a mortician named Glenn Dennis. Dennis did not claim to have seen the bodies himself. His account was indirect. He stated that in July of 1947, he received calls from Roswell Army Airfield asking about the availability of small, hermetically sealed caskets. He found the request unusual. Later, he said a nurse he knew at the base described to him the examination of bodies recovered from the crash. She reportedly told him that the beings were small, with large heads and fragile bodies, and that the conditions of the examination were unlike anything she had experienced. Dennis claimed that shortly after sharing this information, the nurse was transferred and could no longer be contacted. Her identity was never publicly confirmed, which places this testimony in a particular category. Not dismissible, but not verifiable. Another widely discussed testimony came from Jesse Marcel. Marcel was not a civilian observer. He was the intelligence officer assigned to the 509th Composite Group. He was, in effect, one of the people whose job it was to understand unusual materials. Marcel was dispatched to collect the debris found by Mac Brazel. He handled it directly. He transported it, and for decades, he said very little about it publicly. Then, in 1978, more than 30 years after the event, he gave an interview to Stanton Friedman. In that interview, Marcel described the material as unlike anything he had encountered before. He emphasized that it was not consistent with a weather balloon. He stated, carefully but clearly, that in his opinion the debris was not of this earth. This was not a casual statement. It was measured, and it carried weight at least for those inclined to trust his position and experience. But it also arrived decades after the event, which introduces another layer of complexity. Memory changes over time, not intentionally, not deceptively, but inevitably. Details sharpen in some areas and fade in others. Narratives become more coherent. And coherence, while satisfying, is not always perfectly aligned with original events. This does not invalidate testimony, but it does make it more difficult to treat as definitive. As more witnesses came forward in the 1970s and 80s, the Roswell story became richer, more detailed, more populated. It began to include descriptions of multiple crash sites, accounts of military cordons, stories of debris fields stretching over large areas, and in some cases, recollections of a second, more intact craft recovered separately from the primary debris field. Each edition made the story more complete, but also more complex. And complexity, in cases like this, can move in two directions at once. It can increase plausibility for those who see the details as reinforcing, and it can decrease plausibility for those who see the expansion as a sign of narrative drift. The official explanation changed over time, which, in itself, is one of the reasons Roswell has remained such a persistent point of discussion. In 1994, nearly 50 years after the original event, the United States Air Force released a detailed report addressing the Roswell incident. This report attributed the debris to Project Mogul. Project Mogul was a classified program involving high-altitude balloons equipped with acoustic sensors designed to detect Soviet nuclear tests. These balloons were not simple weather balloons. They used advanced materials for their time: reflective foil, balsa wood structures, components that, if found unexpectedly by someone unfamiliar with the program, might appear unusual. The Air Force stated that because Project Mogul was classified in 1947, the military could not publicly identify the debris at the time. The flying disc. Press release was described as a misunderstanding, a result of miscommunication at the local level. The explanation was detailed, technical, structured, and for many it was sufficient, but not for everyone. Researchers who had spent decades collecting witness testimony found the Mogul explanation incomplete. They argued that the materials described in Project Mogul documentation did not match the properties described by witnesses, that the debris, as recalled, behaved in ways that conventional materials, even advanced ones, did not, and that the scale and nature of the military response suggested something more significant than a balloon array. In 1997, a second Air Force report addressed one of the most sensitive aspects of the Roswell story: the reported bodies. This report suggested that witnesses who believed they had seen non-human bodies may have been recalling or conflating later events involving anthropomorphic crash test dummies. These dummies were used in high-altitude drop tests, beginning in the early 1950s. They were, in some cases, small. They were transported in unusual ways, and they were recovered by military personnel. The report proposed that memories of these later tests may have merged with memories of the 1947 debris recovery, creating a composite recollection. This explanation is psychologically plausible. Memory is not a perfect archive. It is influenced by time, context, and subsequent experience. But the explanation also requires a specific kind of memory distortion. It requires witnesses to shift events by several years, to merge separate experiences into a single narrative. Some researchers accept this possibility. Others find it unlikely. And so the conversation continues. The back and forth has never fully resolved. No physical evidence has been publicly produced that confirms the recovery of extraterrestrial material. No verified documents have emerged that clearly demonstrate the existence of a non-human craft or bodies. And yet, the testimony base remains large, persistent, detailed, difficult to simply dismiss without consideration. Roswell exists in a particular kind of space. It is not purely evidence-based. It is not purely speculative. It sits somewhere in between, a place where official records, human memory, cultural context, and long-term curiosity all intersect. And that intersection is not stable. It shifts, depending on who is looking at it, depending on what they value as evidence, depending on how they interpret silence. Because silence in cases like this is not empty. It is interpreted. If you believe institutions are generally trustworthy, silence suggests there is nothing to reveal. If you believe institutions are capable of concealment, silence suggests the opposite. The same absence produces different conclusions, and Roswell, more than almost any other case, demonstrates how that process works. It is not just a story about something that may or may not have happened in a desert in New Mexico. It is a story about how people interpret uncertainty, how they weigh testimony against documentation, how they decide what feels plausible, and how those decisions can remain stable for decades. Roswell is not a closed case. It is not even a case moving steadily toward closure. It is something else, a fixed point in a moving conversation, a reference story, a beginning that never quite becomes an ending. Because the combination of factors present here, a contested official explanation, a large and evolving body of witness testimony, and the absence of publicly available physical evidence, is very good at keeping a question alive. Not loudly, not urgently, but persistently. The kind of persistence that does not demand an answer, but does not forget the question either. Area 51. Few geographical locations carry as much symbolic weight in the American imagination as a dry lake bed in the Nevada desert called Groom Lake. At first glance, it does not appear remarkable. Flat land, pale dust, distant mountains that seem to shimmer slightly in the heat. A sky that feels wider than usual, as if there is simply more of it here than elsewhere. And yet, this quiet, almost empty place has become one of the most discussed and imagined locations on Earth, more commonly known as Area 51, a designation that originated from a grid reference on old Atomic Energy Commission maps. The facility at Groom Lake is a classified United States Air Force installation. It was not always widely acknowledged. For decades, it existed in a kind of official silence. It appeared on no public-facing documentation. It was absent from standard maps. And when questions were asked, the answers, if they came at all, were minimal. The CIA officially acknowledged its existence in 2013. By that point, however, the acknowledgement did not feel like a revelation. It felt like a confirmation of something that had already been understood, at least indirectly, for many years. Satellite imagery had shown the outlines of runways and structures. Former employees had spoken cautiously about their work. Aviation enthusiasts had tracked unusual flight patterns in the surrounding airspace. The existence of the place was not the mystery. The mystery was what happened there, and that question over time became something larger than the facility itself. The claim most commonly associated with Area 51 is that it is the location where recovered extraterrestrial craft, specifically the Roswell wreckage in some versions, were brought for study, reverse engineering, and potentially for housing living or captured extraterrestrial beings. This claim does not exist in isolation. It connects back to Roswell. It connects forward to modern UAP discussions. It acts as a kind of central storage point in the broader narrative, a place where physical evidence, if it exists, would logically be taken. Hidden, studied, it is, in a sense, the physical anchor of an otherwise abstract idea. But alongside this claim, there is a more grounded, well-documented reality. Area 51, as established through declassified records and historical research, served as the primary test facility for some of the most advanced American aircraft of the 20th century. The U-2 spy plane in the 1950s, the A-12 and later the SR-71 Blackbird in the 1960s, the F-117 stealth fighter in the 1980s. Each of these aircraft represented a leap, not a small improvement, a leap. Higher altitudes than had previously been sustained, faster speeds than had been considered practical. Shapes and materials designed not just for performance but for invisibility, not to the human eye but to radar. To someone seeing these aircraft without context, they would not look familiar. They would not behave like ordinary planes. They would not sound like ordinary planes. And sometimes they would not be visible at all, except as light. Many of the UFO sightings reported by civilians and commercial pilots near Area 51 during those decades were, in all likelihood, exactly these aircraft. Objects moving at extraordinary speed, changing direction in ways that appeared abrupt, appearing and disappearing against the night sky, not matching anything listed in publicly known aviation catalogs. These sightings were real. The objects were real. But the explanation was classified, and so the gap between observation and explanation remained open. The Air Force could not acknowledge these aircraft existed. To do so would compromise their strategic value. It would inform adversaries these technologies were designed to create. So when people asked about unusual lights in the sky near Groom Lake, the official response was silence or denial. And that response, repeated over years, created a particular kind of tension. Because people were not imagining everything. They were seeing something, but they were being told that what they were seeing was not there. This is an unusual situation. It is one in which the official statement and the lived experience do not align. And when that misalignment persists, interpretation begins to fill the space. This created, essentially by accident, the perfect conditions for alien mythology to flourish. Here was a place where the government was genuinely concealing something, where genuinely extraordinary craft were genuinely flying, and where official denials were entirely true about aliens and entirely false about everything else. That combination is rare, and it is powerful, because it means that skepticism and belief can both find support in the same set of facts. The legend of Area 51 grew in the space between what was actually secret and what people imagined the secret to be. It did not require fabrication. It required ambiguity. And ambiguity, once established, tends to expand. People talk. Stories circulate. Details are added. And over time, the story becomes more detailed than the original information ever was. The most prominent figure in the Area 51 alien narrative is a man named Bob Lazar. His story enters the timeline decades after Roswell. 1989, television. Las Vegas, a format that feels, even now, slightly theatrical. But the content of what he said was delivered in a way that was not theatrical. It was measured, almost restrained. Lazar claimed that he had worked at a facility adjacent to Area 51, a site he referred to as S4. He described it as a place built into the side of a mountain, partially concealed, a location separate from the main Groom Lake installation. And according to him, the work being conducted there was unlike anything acknowledged publicly. He stated that he had been employed as a physicist, that his role was to study propulsion systems from extraterrestrial spacecraft, not to build, not to design, to understand, to reverse engineer. This distinction is important because it suggests that the technology already existed, that it had been obtained, and that the challenge was not invention, but interpretation. Lazar described the craft in detail. Disc-shaped, smooth, no visible seams. No conventional propulsion systems. He described entering the craft, the interior being smaller than expected, the seating arrangements not aligned with human proportions. Everything in his telling suggested design for a different kind of occupant. He then described the propulsion system, an element he called Element 115. At the time, this element did not officially exist. It was beyond the known periodic table. Lazar claimed that this element produced a gravitational field, that this field could be amplified, focused, used to bend space itself, allowing the craft to move not by pushing against air or expelling fuel, but by altering the space around it. It is a concept that, even now, sits at the edge of theoretical physics. Not entirely impossible, but not experimentally realized. In 2003, scientists synthesized an element with atomic number 115. It was named moscovium. This detail became a focal point. Supporters of Lazar pointed to it as evidence that he had knowledge ahead of its time. Critics noted that the existence of such elements had been predicted decades earlier, and that the properties of moscovium, highly unstable, decaying in fractions of a second, did not match the stable, usable material Lazar had described. Both interpretations remain, and neither fully resolves the question. Lazar's background became another area of focus. He claimed degrees from MIT and Caltech. Records could not confirm this. Employment history was inconsistent. Some aspects of his life were documented, others were not. Lazar maintained that his records had been erased, part of a deliberate effort to discredit him. Skeptics argued that the lack of records suggested fabrication. The discussion moved, as it often does, away from the claim itself and toward the credibility of the person making it, which is a difficult space to resolve, because credibility is not binary. It is assessed, interpreted, weighted differently by different people. Whether Lazar is a genuine whistleblower, an elaborate fabricator, or something in between remains contested. And it has remained contested for decades. What is not contested is that Area 51 is real, that it contains facilities that have never been publicly described in full, that it operates within a level of secrecy that is both intentional and ongoing, and that this secrecy, regardless of its purpose, creates an environment in which speculation is not only possible, but almost inevitable. Because when information is absent, the mind does not remain empty. It fills, sometimes cautiously, sometimes creatively, sometimes with structures that become more detailed over time than the reality they attempt to explain. Area 51 exists at the intersection of those processes. It is a real place, with real secrecy, and with a narrative that has grown far beyond what can be confirmed. Separating the documented from the imagined is not always straightforward, because they share the same space, the same name, the same boundaries on a map, and so the question remains, Not loudly, not urgently, but consistently. What is happening there now? And it is a question that, like many in this landscape, does not require an answer to continue existing. It only requires the possibility that one exists, somewhere beyond the fence line, somewhere just out of view. Underlying both Roswell and Area 51, and indeed most of the major alien conspiracy theories, is a central claim. It is not about a single event, not about one crash, not about one sighting. It is broader than that. The claim is this, that the United States government, and possibly other governments, have known for decades that extraterrestrial intelligence exists, has made contact or recovered physical evidence of that intelligence, and has deliberately prevented this information from reaching the public. This is the meta-theory, the framework that holds many of the other theories together, because without it, individual stories remain isolated. With it, they become connected. Roswell is not just an incident, it becomes the beginning. Area 51 is not just a test facility, it becomes a storage site. Witnesses are not just individuals with unusual experiences, they become fragments of a larger pattern. The cover-up theory gives structure. It turns scattered data points into a continuous narrative. And that narrative is built on a simple idea, that knowledge exists, and that it is being withheld. This idea did not appear suddenly. It developed over time. Gradually, as people began to notice a recurring pattern in how information was handled. Unusual event, initial acknowledgement, sometimes, followed by retraction, followed by silence, followed by denial, and then, years later, partial release. Documents declassified, programs acknowledged, details emerging slowly, often long after they could have immediate impact. This pattern is not unique to the UFO subject. It exists in many areas of government activity, military technology, intelligence operations, scientific research with strategic implications. Secrecy in these contexts is not unusual. It is expected, but when that same pattern appears around something as fundamentally significant as the possibility of non-human intelligence, the interpretation changes because the stakes feel different, higher, more universal. The cover-up theory suggests that this familiar pattern of secrecy has been applied to something far more profound than conventional military projects, and that the public, recognizing the pattern but not the full content, has attempted to reconstruct what might be hidden behind it. For many years, this theory existed largely outside official channels. It was discussed in books, in documentaries, in interviews with former military personnel and researchers, but it did not often enter formal government spaces. That began to change, slowly at first, then more noticeably. The cover-up theory received significant new momentum in 2017. That was the year the New York Times published its article about the Pentagon's Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program, ATIP. The program had operated quietly for several years, funded, staffed, investigating reports of unidentified aerial phenomena. The existence of such a program suggested something important. Not necessarily that extraterrestrial technology had been confirmed, but that the phenomenon was considered real enough and potentially significant enough to warrant structured, ongoing analysis within the Department of Defense. Alongside the article, the Pentagon released videos, not leaked footage, not anonymous sources, officially released recordings, taken by military aircraft, reviewed by trained personnel, objects moving in ways that were not easily explained, no immediate conclusion offered, just acknowledgement. This was a shift, because for decades the official posture had been more dismissive. Now it was more open, carefully open, but open. The conversation moved slightly from the margins toward the center. And then, in 2023, it moved again, this time into a setting that carried a different kind of weight, a congressional hearing, a formal setting, structured, recorded, part of the public record. A former intelligence official named David Grush testified before a United States congressional subcommittee under oath. His role, prior to coming forward, involved working within the intelligence community on matters related to unidentified aerial phenomena. He was not presenting himself as an outsider. He was presenting himself as someone who had been inside the system. And what he said was careful, measured. He did not claim to have personally handled extraterrestrial material. He did not claim direct observation. Instead, he described what he had been told, what he had encountered in the course of his official duties. Grush stated that he had become aware of long-running programs within the United States government, programs that, according to the individuals he spoke with, were in possession of non-human craft, and, in some cases, biological material of non-human origin. He described these programs as deeply classified, operating with limited oversight, difficult to access even for individuals with high-level clearance. He said that when he attempted to gain access to these programs through official channels, he was denied, not redirected, not delayed, denied. He also stated that colleagues who had worked within these programs had faced professional consequences for attempting to bring information forward, retaliation, career pressure, subtle and not so subtle signals that certain topics were not to be pursued. These claims, presented under oath, carried a particular kind of gravity, not because they were immediately verifiable, but because of the setting in which they were made. This was not an interview, not a documentary, not a second-hand retelling. It was testimony, entered into record, subject to legal consequences if intentionally false. Grush named no specific locations, no physical evidence. He acknowledged that his knowledge was based on conversations with others, on briefings, on information that he had been given access to, but not the material itself. This is important because it places his testimony in a specific category, not direct evidence, but not casual speculation either, something in between. Second-hand, but structured. Informed, but incomplete. The testimony was historic in tone. A former senior intelligence official stating in a formal setting that the government possesses non-human technology. That statement by itself would have been almost unthinkable in a public forum just a decade earlier. And yet, it did not resolve anything, because claims, even serious ones, require verification. The Department of Defense responded, calmly, directly. It stated that it had found no verifiable information to support Grush's claims. No confirmed programs, no confirmed materials, no evidence that could be publicly substantiated. This response did not dismiss the phenomenon entirely, but it did reject the specific assertion that non-human craft were in government possession. And so, once again, two positions emerged. One from inside the system, suggesting hidden knowledge, one from the institution itself, stating that no such knowledge could be confirmed. And between those positions, the question remained, this is a familiar structure. It mirrors earlier patterns. Claim, denial, continuation. The conversation, as of the time this script was written, remains very much ongoing. Investigations continue. Hearings continue. Documents are requested. Some are released. Others remain classified. The public receives fragments, pieces, enough to stay engaged, not enough to reach a definitive conclusion. And in that space, the cover-up theory continues to exist, not as a single claim, but as a framework, a way of interpreting the absence of clear answers. It is worth considering quietly why such a cover-up would exist if it were real. Several explanations are commonly proposed. One is control. That knowledge of extraterrestrial intelligence would disrupt existing power structures, religious frameworks, political systems, economic models. Another is fear, that the implications of contact or even confirmed observation would create widespread uncertainty, panic, instability. A third is uncertainty itself, that governments may not fully understand what they are dealing with, and that withholding information is not about deception, but about avoiding premature conclusions. These explanations are not mutually exclusive. They overlap. They reflect different ways of thinking about responsibility and risk. There is also a simpler possibility that the appearance of a cover-up emerges naturally from the way large institutions manage information. Compartmentalization. Need to know access, layers of classification. In such systems, information is often fragmented. No single individual has the full picture. And when someone encounters part of that picture, it can appear larger than it is, or more connected, or more intentional. This does not mean there is no hidden information, but it suggests that the structure of secrecy itself can produce the impression of a unified, deliberate concealment, even when the reality is more diffuse. The challenge, then, is not simply determining whether a cover-up exists. It is understanding what kind of cover-up it would be: deliberate, coordinated, global, or partial, fragmented, emerging from overlapping systems rather than a single guiding decision. At present, there is no publicly available evidence that conclusively resolves that question, and so it remains open. Not unresolved in the sense of confusion, but open in the sense of ongoing. A question that continues to be asked, examined, reframed. The government cover-up theory is not sustained by a single piece of evidence. It is sustained by a pattern of secrecy, a pattern of partial disclosure, a pattern of statements that neither fully confirm nor fully dismiss. And patterns, once recognized, are difficult to unsee. They shape how new information is interpreted, how silence is understood, how statements are weighed, and so the theory persists, not loudly, not always at the forefront, but steadily, in the background of every new development, every new report, every new hearing. A quiet possibility that what is known may not be everything that is said, and that what is said may not be everything that is known. The Men in Black, so deeply embedded in popular culture through films, television series, and decades of references, that it is easy to forget the reports that inspired the mythology were treated, at the time they were made, as entirely serious. Today, the phrase can feel almost playful, familiar, associated with humor, with stylized suits and carefully scripted dialogue, but the original accounts did not feel that way. They felt unsettling, quietly intrusive, difficult to explain, and often deeply personal. The original Men in Black reports began in the early 1950s and accelerated through the 1960s. This was a period when UFO sightings were increasing. Public interest was growing. Civilian research groups were forming. And information was beginning to circulate more widely, not yet through the internet, but through newsletters, radio programs, local newspapers. Word of mouth. It was, in a sense, an early network. Loose, informal, but active. And within that network, certain patterns began to emerge. The basic structure of these accounts was consistent across many different witnesses who had no apparent connection to each other. That consistency is one of the reasons the stories endured, because while details varied, the sequence remained familiar. A person would have a UFO sighting, or they would become involved in researching UFOs, writing about them, speaking about them, collecting reports. And then, sometime afterward, something would happen. A visit, unexpected, unannounced. Often at home, sometimes at a workplace, sometimes in transit. One or more men would arrive, dressed in black suits, formal, out of place in casual settings. Their appearance was often described as slightly unusual, not dramatically so, not immediately alarming, but subtly different. Skin tone that seemed pale or slightly artificial. Facial expressions that appeared fixed or slightly delayed. Movements that were precise, controlled. Almost rehearsed, they would often arrive in black cars. Vehicles that did not always match common models. Sometimes older, sometimes difficult to identify. The witnesses rarely focused on the car itself. Their attention tended to remain on the visitors. The men would present themselves as officials, sometimes showing identification, sometimes not. The identification, when shown, was not always examined closely. The situation itself often discouraged detailed inspection. There was a sense of authority, or at least the appearance of authority, and then the conversation would begin. The tone varied. In some accounts, it was calm, polite, measured. In others, it carried an undercurrent of pressure, not overtly threatening, but suggestive. The message, however, was consistent. Do not speak about what you have seen. Do not continue your research. Do not share this information. The reasons given were often vague. National security, public safety, sometimes no reason at all, just instruction. In some cases, the visitors demonstrated knowledge that the witness had not shared publicly. Details of a sighting, names of people involved, private information. This element, the knowledge, is one of the aspects that made the encounters particularly difficult to dismiss for those who experienced them, because it suggested access, observation, awareness that extended beyond what should have been available. The most commonly cited early cases involve a researcher named Albert Bender. Bender was not a casual observer. He was an organizer. He founded the International Flying Saucer Bureau in the early 1950s, one of the first civilian groups dedicated to collecting and analyzing UFO reports. He published a newsletter, connected with other researchers, built a small but active network, and then, in 1953, he stopped, abruptly. Without warning, the organization closed. The newsletter ended, and Bender withdrew from public involvement. At the time, the explanation was unclear. Later, Bender stated that he had been visited by 3 men in dark suits, that they had provided him with information about UFOs, and that the information had frightened him, enough to stop his work entirely. He did not immediately describe what he had been told. He remained silent for years. Nearly a decade passed before he published a book describing his experience. Even then, the details were unusual, difficult to categorize, blending elements that some readers interpreted as psychological and others interpreted as literal. This ambiguity did not reduce interest. If anything, it increased it, because unanswered questions tend to draw attention. Other researchers and witnesses reported similar visits, independent accounts, different locations, different individuals, but with familiar elements. Men in dark suits, unusual demeanor, knowledge that seemed out of place, requests or instructions to remain silent. Some witnesses described the men as appearing almost artificial, as if they were imitating human behavior rather than naturally expressing it. Speech patterns that were slightly off. Pauses in conversation that did not follow expected rhythms. Occasional misuse of common phrases. These details are subtle, but they are repeated often enough to become part of the broader pattern. In some accounts, the encounters ended quickly. A brief conversation, a clear message. Departure. In others, they were more extended. Conversations that lasted longer. Questions asked. Information exchanged. The witnesses often reported a lingering sense of unease after the encounter. Not always fear, but a feeling that something about the interaction did not fully align with ordinary experience. Explanations for the men in black have ranged widely. Some researchers have suggested they were genuine government agents, possibly from Air Force intelligence, possibly from other agencies involved in monitoring aerial phenomena, tasked with suppressing UFO reports that might intersect with classified military activity. This explanation has a certain grounding. They do manage narratives around sensitive topics, and during the early Cold War period, information control was considered a critical part of national security. If unusual sightings risked exposing classified aircraft programs, it would not be unreasonable for officials to discourage public discussion. But there are elements of the Men in Black accounts that do not fit neatly within that framework. The unusual behavior, the physical descriptions, the tone of interaction. These details have led others to consider different possibilities. Some have proposed that the Men in Black were not entirely human, that they were entities attempting to pass as human, operating with a purpose that was not fully aligned with any known government structure. Others have suggested a hybrid explanation that they were human but working in coordination with non-human intelligence, serving as intermediaries, managing contact, controlling information flow. These interpretations extend beyond what can be verified, but they persist, because the accounts themselves leave room for them. There is also a psychological dimension to consider. Encounters that occur after a significant or unusual experience, such as a UFO sighting, may be influenced by heightened awareness, increased attention to detail, a sense of importance attached to subsequent events. This does not invalidate the experience, but it can shape how it is perceived, how it is remembered, how it is described, and over time, as stories are shared, compared, and retold, patterns can emerge not only from events themselves, but from the way those events are processed. The Men in Black accounts share an interesting feature with many other elements of the UFO landscape. They are difficult to verify because they often involve private encounters. No recordings, no third-party observers, no physical evidence. They are also difficult to falsify because the absence of evidence does not contradict the experience. It simply leaves it unconfirmed. And they are structurally self-reinforcing because within the framework of the theory, the act of investigation itself can become evidence. If someone reports being visited after researching UFOs, that visit is interpreted as confirmation that the research is touching something real. If no visit occurs, it can be interpreted as evidence that the person has not yet reached a point of significance. Either outcome fits within the structure, and structures like that tend to persist, not because they are proven, but because they are adaptable. The Men in Black, in this sense, are less a single phenomenon and more a recurring pattern of experience, one that sits at the intersection of secrecy, perception, and narrative. They represent something that appears briefly, leaves an impression, and then disappears again, without clear resolution, without documentation, but not without effect, because for the individuals who report these encounters, the experience is not abstract. It is immediate, it is remembered, and it often changes how they engage with the subject afterward, sometimes leading them away from it, sometimes drawing them deeper into it. And so the stories continue, not loudly, not constantly, but steadily, appearing in different places at different times, with familiar elements. And, like many aspects of this broader landscape, they do not demand a conclusion. They simply remain a presence at the edge of the conversation, difficult to define, difficult to dismiss, and, in their own quiet way, difficult to forget. Alien abduction. The alien abduction phenomenon is, in terms of the number of people it involves and the depth of its impact on their lives, among the most significant and least understood aspects of the broader UFO subject. It is also one of the most personal, unlike sightings in the sky, which can be shared across a group of observers, or radar contacts which exist as data points. Abduction accounts happen at the level of the individual. They unfold in bedrooms, on quiet roads, in isolated stretches of landscape where there are no other witnesses and often no physical traces that can be easily verified. What remains is the memory, or, in many cases, the absence of memory. The modern abduction narrative began in its most recognized form with a couple named Barney and Betty Hill. On the night of September 19, 1961, the Hills were driving home through rural New Hampshire when they reported observing a large, pancake-shaped craft that seemed to follow their car. They reported a period of missing time, roughly 2 hours, that they could not account for. They arrived home feeling anxious and disoriented. In the months that followed, both Barney and Betty experienced vivid and disturbing dreams, under hypnosis conducted by a psychiatrist named Benjamin Simon. Each of them independently described being taken aboard the craft, examined by non-human beings, and returned to their car with their memories suppressed. The Hills were a private couple. They did not seek publicity. Barney, who was black, was in many ways deeply private about the experience, in part because he was aware of how the story would be received. Their account became public largely because a journalist learned of it and published an article without their consent. What made the Hill case unusual, and what made it foundational for the abduction phenomenon, was the consistency between the two accounts, despite being collected separately, and the details that seemed to subsequent researchers oddly specific in ways that went beyond what the Hills could have fabricated. But there was another detail, quieter, and in some ways more unsettling. Barney Hill, under hypnosis, described the beings as having large eyes, greyish skin, and a presence that he found deeply disturbing. His descriptions did not match any popular image of extraterrestrials at the time. The now familiar grey alien archetype had not yet fully entered public consciousness. This detail would become important later. Betty Hill drew a star map she said she had been shown aboard the craft. Years later, a school teacher named Marjorie Fish constructed a three-dimensional model of nearby star systems and identified a configuration that appeared to match Betty's drawing. Centered on a binary star system called Zeta Reticuli, approximately 39 light-years from Earth. The Zeta Reticuli interpretation has been debated extensively by astronomers. Some have found the match suggestive. Others have argued that with enough data points and enough flexibility in interpretation, many configurations could be made to match. The debate remains unresolved. In the decades following the Hills, thousands of people came forward with similar accounts. And as those accounts accumulated, certain patterns began to emerge. A researcher named Bud Hopkins, who was a painter by profession, began collecting and documenting abduction testimonies in the 1970s. He noticed that individuals who had never met, who lived in different parts of the country, and who came from very different backgrounds, described experiences that followed a similar sequence. The experience often began with a sense of presence, a feeling that something was in the room. Then came paralysis, the inability to move or speak, a state in which the body seemed to no longer respond, even as the mind remained awake. Then the appearance of beings, usually small in stature, large heads, large, dark eyes, minimal visible facial features. The individual would then report being taken, sometimes through walls, sometimes through windows, sometimes simply finding themselves no longer in their original location. Inside the craft, the descriptions became more clinical. Bright lights, smooth surfaces, a sense of sterility. Examinations were frequently described. Instruments, procedures, a particular focus in many accounts on reproductive organs, the collection of biological material. Then, after some period of time, which often did not correspond to the passage of time experienced outside, the individual would be returned, often to the exact location from which they had been taken. And then, in many cases, the memory would be gone. What remained instead was a gap, missing time, a sense that something had happened, without the ability to say what. This structure, presence, paralysis, transport, examination, return, missing time, became the basic framework of the modern abduction narrative. But within that framework, there were variations. Some individuals reported communication, not spoken language, but something more like direct thought. Ideas placed into the mind without words, a sense of being observed, studied, sometimes reassured, sometimes warned. A few described messages about the environment, about nuclear weapons, about the future of humanity. Others described something more ambiguous, a feeling that the beings were neither hostile nor benevolent, but simply focused, task-oriented, as if the human subject was part of a process that had its own logic, but not necessarily its own concern for human comfort. Harvard psychiatrist John Mack, a Pulitzer Prize-winning author, spent more than a decade interviewing abductees. He approached the subject cautiously at first. His training was in clinical psychiatry. His expectation was that he would find psychological explanations for what his patients were describing. But over time, he found that the individuals he interviewed did not fit easily into categories of delusion or psychosis. They were, in many cases, psychologically stable, functioning in their daily lives, often reluctant to speak about their experiences because of the social consequences. Mack concluded that he could not dismiss their accounts as simple hallucination or fabrication. He acknowledged that this conclusion placed him in an uncomfortable position relative to his academic colleagues. He was subjected to a formal review by Harvard. He continued his research regardless, until his death in 2004. Other researchers approached the phenomenon differently. David Jacobs, a historian, focused on the consistency of the narratives and developed the hybridization theory, the idea that the abduction process was part of a long-term effort to create a human-alien hybrid population. Jacobs reported that many abductees described being shown children, beings that appeared partly human and partly something else, and being told or made to feel that they had some connection to them. This aspect of the phenomenon is among the most emotionally intense. For those who report it, the experience is not abstract. It is deeply personal. It involves identity, family, and a sense of participation in something that is not fully understood. Skeptics have raised important questions about methodology. Much of the detailed abduction testimony has been obtained through hypnosis. Hypnosis, while useful in certain therapeutic contexts, is also known to increase suggestibility. It can lead to the creation of false memories, experiences that feel entirely real to the person recalling them, but that may not correspond to actual events. Psychologists have demonstrated in controlled settings that individuals under hypnosis can construct detailed and emotionally convincing narratives in response to subtle cues from the person conducting the session. This does not mean that all hypnotically recovered memories are false, but it does mean that the method requires caution. Sleep paralysis has also been proposed as an explanation for many abduction experiences. During sleep paralysis, the body remains in a state of temporary immobility, while the mind becomes partially awake. This state can be accompanied by vivid hallucinations, often involving a presence in the room, sometimes involving figures, pressure on the chest, or a sensation of being moved. Sleep paralysis has been reported across cultures for centuries, often interpreted through the lens of local belief systems, demons, spirits, witches. In the modern context, it is sometimes interpreted as alien visitation. This explanation accounts for some aspects of abduction reports, particularly the initial stages. But it does not easily account for the full structure of many narratives, particularly those involving missing time in outdoor settings, or those involving multiple witnesses. There are also cases in which individuals report physical marks, small scars, unusual bruising, appearing after an experience they cannot fully remember. These marks are not in themselves definitive evidence of anything unusual. The human body acquires marks in many ordinary ways, but in the context of an already unexplained experience, they take on additional meaning for the person involved. And meaning, once attached, is difficult to remove. Another dimension of the abduction phenomenon is its persistence over time. Many abductees report that their experiences are not isolated. They describe multiple encounters, sometimes beginning in childhood and continuing into adulthood, a sense of being followed or monitored or revisited. This continuity adds another layer of complexity. A single anomalous experience can be set aside. A pattern that repeats over years is more difficult to categorize. And yet, even here, there are questions. Memory is not static, it evolves. An experience interpreted one way at one point in life may be reinterpreted later, especially after exposure to similar accounts in books, documentaries, or online communities. The line between experience and interpretation can become blurred. The abduction phenomenon sits, perhaps more than any other part of the alien subject, at the intersection of psychology, culture, and whatever may or may not exist beyond those domains. The experiences are clearly real to those who report them. The emotional impact is real. The fear, the confusion, the sense of disruption. Lives have been shaped by these experiences. Careers have been redirected. Relationships have been strained. Belief systems have been altered. Whether the source of those experiences is internal, external, or something that does not fit neatly into either category remains an open question. And it is a question that, for many people, is not abstract. It is something that happened to them, or something they believe happened to them. And that distinction, depending on where you stand, may feel either very important or not important at all. What can be said with some certainty is that the abduction phenomenon has persisted for more than half a century. It has appeared in different countries, different cultures, different languages. It has adapted slightly to the imagery and expectations of each era, but the core structure has remained remarkably consistent, which leaves us, as with so many things in this landscape, in a quiet place, with a pattern that is difficult to explain. with experiences that are difficult to dismiss, and with an answer that, for now, remains just out of reach. If the abduction phenomenon feels personal and immediate, the ancient alien theory feels distant and expansive. It does not begin in bedrooms or on quiet highways. It begins thousands of years ago, in stone, in myth, and in the earliest attempts human beings made to explain the world around them. The central idea is simple. Extraterrestrial beings visited Earth in the distant past, and what ancient people recorded as gods, spirits, or divine beings may, in some interpretations, have been encounters with something not entirely human. This idea has been explored in many ways, but it entered modern popular culture most prominently through a book published in 1968 by a Swiss author named Erich von Däniken. The book was titled Chariots of the Gods. Von Däniken proposed that many of the great achievements of ancient civilizations, their architecture, their astronomical knowledge, their mythology, could not be fully explained by the capabilities of those civilizations alone. Instead, he suggested that these societies may have received assistance, guidance, instruction, perhaps even direct intervention. From visitors, the theory did not emerge in isolation. It built on earlier ideas, on 19th century speculation about lost civilizations, on early 20th century fascination with Egypt and Mesopotamia, on a long human habit of looking at the past and seeing mystery where understanding is incomplete. But von Däniken gave it a new shape. He connected sites across continents. He asked similar questions about all of them, and he offered a single, unifying answer. One of the most frequently cited examples in this theory is the Great Pyramid of Giza. Constructed more than 4,000 years ago, the pyramid consists of approximately 2.3 million stone blocks, many weighing several tons each. The alignment of the structure is precise. Its sides are oriented almost perfectly to the cardinal directions: north, south, east, and west. Its proportions have been described as mathematically significant. Some researchers have pointed to relationships between the pyramid's dimensions and certain mathematical constants. To proponents of the ancient alien theory, this level of precision suggests knowledge that goes beyond what was traditionally attributed to ancient Egyptian builders. The question is often framed quietly: how did they do it? Conventional archaeology provides answers: large labor forces, ramps, levers, careful planning over decades. Experimental archaeology has demonstrated that blocks of similar size can be moved using relatively simple tools when enough people are involved. The construction was not quick. It was not easy. But it was possible. And yet, even with these explanations, the scale of the achievement can feel difficult to fully absorb. Standing at the base of the pyramid, the stones are not abstract. They are massive, physical, immovable to the individual observer. The gap between what one person can do and what a civilization can do becomes very visible. And in that gap, questions tend to grow. Another often cited example lies far from Egypt, in the high plains of Peru, the Nazca Lines. These are enormous geoglyphs, drawings etched into the desert floor, depicting animals, geometric shapes, and long straight lines that stretch for miles. They are only fully visible from the air. From ground level, they are difficult to recognize as coherent images. This has led to a persistent question. Why would a culture create designs that can only be properly seen from above? Ancient alien theorists suggest that the lines may have been intended as signals, markers, landing guides, messages to beings who could observe them from the sky. Archaeologists, again, offer grounded explanations. The Nazca people likely created the lines by removing darker surface stones to reveal lighter soil beneath. The The dry climate preserved them. The designs may have had ritual significance, ceremonial pathways, connections to water sources, expressions of cosmology, and while they are most easily appreciated from the air, they can be planned and constructed from the ground, using simple surveying techniques. Both perspectives exist. The lines remain silent, unexplained in the sense that their exact purpose is not definitively known. In Bolivia, at a site called Pumapunku, the questions take a slightly different form. The stones here are not just large. They are shaped, cut with sharp angles, smooth surfaces, interlocking forms that fit together with remarkable precision. Some of the blocks appear almost modular, as if they were designed to be assembled in a system. The precision of these cuts has led some observers to suggest the use of advanced tools that would not traditionally be associated with the culture believed to have built the site. Ancient alien proponents point to these details as evidence of external assistance. Archaeologists point to the possibility of skilled craftsmanship, time, and techniques that have not been fully reconstructed in modern experiments. There is also the reality that ancient people were not less intelligent than modern people. They had different tools, different materials. Still, Pumapunku has a presence that invites speculation. The stones feel deliberate in a way that is difficult to casually dismiss. Beyond architecture, the ancient alien theory extends into mythology. Ancient texts from many cultures describe beings descending from the sky. In Mesopotamian traditions, there are the Anunnaki. In certain interpretations, they are described as powerful beings who came from the heavens and played a role in shaping early human civilization. In Hindu texts, there are descriptions of Vimanas, flying vehicles used by gods. These descriptions include details that, when read through a modern lens, can resemble technological imagery. In the Hebrew Bible, the prophet Ezekiel describes a vision of a wheel within a wheel, accompanied by fire, light, and movement. Some readers have interpreted this as a symbolic description of a spacecraft. Others view it as purely spiritual language. The interpretation often depends on the framework the reader brings to the text. If one expects metaphor, the text reads as metaphor. If one allows for the possibility of misunderstood technology, the same words can take on a different shape. One of the most influential figures in this area was Zecharia Sitchin. He proposed that the Anunnaki were not symbolic beings, but literal extraterrestrials from a planet in our solar system. According to Sitchin, these beings came to Earth hundreds of thousands of years ago and genetically engineered early humans. This interpretation is not accepted by mainstream scholars of ancient languages. They argue that Sitchin's translations do not align with established linguistic methods. Sitchin maintained that conventional translations were incomplete. The debate continues largely without resolution because it depends not only on language but on interpretation. And interpretation is not always something that can be settled conclusively. What makes the ancient alien theory particularly enduring is not any single piece of evidence. It is the pattern. Similar structures across distant cultures. Similar myths about beings from the sky. Similar artistic motifs. Similar questions about how certain achievements were accomplished. To those who support the theory, this pattern suggests a shared influence. To those who are skeptical, it suggests something else, that human beings separated by distance and time often arrive at similar ideas, that the sky has always been a source of mystery, that stories about beings descending from above are a natural extension of looking upward and wondering what might be there. There is also a quieter dimension to this theory, one that is less about evidence and more about perspective. If ancient humans did encounter something they could not explain, how would they describe it? They would use the language available to them: gods, spirits, chariots, fire, light. Not because those were precise descriptions, but because they were the closest available approximations. And if we today encountered something equally outside our understanding, it is possible we would do the same. We would describe it using the closest concepts we have: technology, spacecraft, aliens, different words. The same attempt to understand something unfamiliar, the ancient alien theory does not offer a single clean answer. It offers a reinterpretation, a way of looking at the past that places humanity in a slightly different position. Not entirely alone in its development, not entirely isolated in its progress, but part of a larger, more complex story. Whether that story is literal, symbolic, or something in between is not something that has been definitively established. And perhaps that is part of why the idea persists, because it allows the past to remain slightly open, not fully explained, not fully closed. A place where possibility can still exist. And as with everything we have walked through tonight, it leaves us in a familiar place, with remarkable achievements that are undeniably real, with explanations that are plausible but not always emotionally satisfying, and with a quiet sense that even in the oldest parts of human history, there may still be details we do not fully understand. Details that sit patiently in stone, waiting. The hybridization program. Some researchers and experiencers who have explored the abduction phenomenon in depth have developed a theory that goes further than simple visitation or examination. It moves beyond the idea of observation, beyond the idea of curiosity, into something that feels more deliberate, more structured, more long-term. The hybridization theory proposes that the extraterrestrial beings conducting abductions have a specific and ongoing objective: the creation of a hybrid species, a form of life that combines human and non-human genetic material, not as a single experiment, but as a program, something that unfolds gradually, over time, across generations. This idea does not emerge from physical evidence in the traditional sense. It emerges from patterns within testimony, from the details that appear again and again in accounts collected from individuals who, in many cases, have never met each other, who live in different countries, who come from different cultures, who, in some cases, did not even believe in extraterrestrial life before their experiences began, and yet describe similar sequences, similar environments, similar procedures. This theory draws heavily on the content of abduction testimonies. Many of these include accounts of what appear to be medical examinations, clinical in tone, systematic in structure, often focused on the body in ways that feel precise rather than random. In particular, a significant number of accounts describe procedures involving reproductive organs, the extraction of sperm, the removal of ova, the sense that biological material is being collected, catalogued, used. These descriptions are often reported with a certain emotional distance, as if the experience itself was controlled, as if the individual was aware but unable to resist, unable to fully react. A kind of passive participation in something that is happening with or without consent. And then there are the other accounts, the ones that move beyond examination, into something quieter. And, for many people, more unsettling. Some abductees report being shown children, small figures, humanoid but not entirely human, large eyes, delicate features, a physical appearance that seems to sit somewhere between familiarity and difference. The abductee is not always told what these beings are, but there is often a feeling, a recognition, that does not come from logic. A sense, sometimes described as immediate and undeniable, that these beings are connected to them, related to them. In some accounts, the individual is encouraged to interact with the child, to hold them, to comfort them, to teach them, as if the purpose is not only biological, but developmental, as if something is being raised, guided, brought closer, step by step, to something more human. Bud Hopkins was among the first researchers to take these accounts seriously as a pattern rather than as isolated experiences. He approached the subject initially as an artist, curious, observant. He began collecting testimonies in the 1970s, listening carefully, noticing repetition, noticing structure. He documented cases in which individuals described similar reproductive procedures without prior exposure to each other's stories. He noted that many abductees reported recurring experiences over years, sometimes beginning in childhood, continuing into adulthood, a sense of being part of something ongoing, something that did not begin with a single event and did not end with one either. Hopkins interpreted these patterns as evidence of a coordinated process, not random encounters, not accidental contact, but a program with continuity. David Jacobs extended this work further. Where Hopkins observed, Jacobs organized. Where Hopkins documented, Jacobs theorized. Jacobs interviewed hundreds of individuals. He focused on the consistency of their accounts, on the recurring elements that appeared across different cases. He concluded that the hybridization process was not only real within the framework of these testimonies, but advanced, well developed, approaching completion. In his interpretation, Jacobs proposed that hybrid beings were not confined to spacecraft or isolated environments, that they were being integrated, introduced into human society, gradually, in ways that would not immediately disrupt the surface of everyday life. He described scenarios in which abductees reported being asked to assist these beings, to help them understand human behavior, to teach them how to blend in, how to speak, how to interact, how to exist in a world that was not originally theirs. Jacobs was clear about his own reaction to these conclusions. He did not find them exciting. He did not present them as a hopeful future. He described them as deeply concerning, even unsettling. There is a particular tone that appears in many of these accounts, a sense that the beings involved are not acting out of malice, but also not out of empathy. They are often described as focused, efficient, engaged in a process that does not pause to consider the emotional experience of the human participants. This absence of emotional framing is what many abductees find most difficult to describe. There is no clear hostility, but there is also no clear compassion, only purpose. Some accounts include descriptions of different types of beings, not just one, but several. Smaller figures, often associated with the examination process. Taller figures, sometimes described as more authoritative. And then the hybrids themselves, at different stages of development. Some appearing more alien, others appearing almost entirely human, but with subtle differences. Eyes that hold slightly longer contact. Expressions that seem practiced rather than natural. Movements that are just slightly out of rhythm. These details are not universal, but they appear often enough to form a pattern within the larger narrative. This theory sits at the extreme edge of what can be evaluated. The evidence is almost entirely testimonial, collected through interviews, often through hypnotic regression. And this introduces significant complexity. Hypnosis is not a neutral tool. It can reveal, but it can also shape. It can help access memories, but it can also create them. Psychologists have shown that under hypnosis, individuals can construct detailed and convincing narratives in response to subtle suggestions. Memories can become more vivid, more structured, more emotionally real, even if they do not correspond to actual events. This does not mean that all hypnotically recovered accounts are false, but it does mean that they cannot be taken at face value without careful consideration. Skeptics argue that the hybridization narrative may be an extension of cultural influence, that as abduction stories became more widely known, certain themes began to repeat, that individuals, consciously or unconsciously, incorporated these themes into their own experiences or recollections. The idea of reproductive experimentation, for example, appears frequently in science fiction. The image of hybrid beings appears in literature, film, and television. Exposure to these ideas can shape how ambiguous experiences are interpreted, how memories are reconstructed. And yet, there are elements that complicate this explanation. Some accounts predate widespread media exposure to these specific ideas. Some individuals report experiences before they had encountered any similar narratives. Children, in particular, have reported experiences with details that align with adult accounts, despite having limited exposure to the broader cultural framework. There are also cases in which individuals describe experiences reluctantly, with hesitation, without the desire to share, without the sense that they are participating in a known narrative. These details do not confirm the theory, but they make it more difficult to dismiss entirely. Another aspect that researchers have noted is the emotional consistency. The feelings described by abductees tend to fall within a narrow range: confusion, vulnerability, a sense of intrusion, sometimes curiosity, sometimes a strange, reluctant acceptance. These are not the emotional tones typically associated with deliberate fabrication. They are quieter, more ambiguous, more difficult to perform consistently over time. There is also the question of continuity. Many abductees describe experiences that occur repeatedly, at intervals that are not always predictable, over spans of years, sometimes decades. They describe a sense that the process is ongoing, that it did not begin with a single event, and that it has not concluded. This continuity creates a narrative that extends beyond individual memory into something that feels structured, even if the structure itself is not fully visible. And still, there is no physical evidence, no confirmed biological samples, no independently verified documentation, no direct observation that can be studied under controlled conditions. The entire framework rests on experience, on memory, on interpretation, and on the patterns that emerge when many such experiences are placed side by side. The hybridization theory, like many of the deeper layers of the alien phenomenon, does not resolve easily. It exists in a space where multiple explanations can coexist: psychological, cultural, biological, or something that does not fit neatly into any of those categories. For some, it represents a hidden process, quiet, ongoing, unacknowledged. For others, it represents a narrative constructed from human experience interacting with uncertainty, a way of making sense of something that does not yet have a clear explanation. What makes this theory linger is not certainty, it is structure. The sense that the accounts taken together form something that looks like a pattern, even if the origin of that pattern is not agreed upon, even if its meaning is still unclear. And so it remains, a theory built from stories. from moments that people carry with them, sometimes for their entire lives. Moments that feel real. Moments that resist easy explanation. Moments that, when placed side by side, begin to suggest something larger. Something that may or may not exist beyond the telling of it. And as with everything else we have explored tonight, it leaves us in a familiar place. Not with an answer, but with a shape, a possibility, a quiet, persistent idea that something may be happening just outside the edges of what we can currently confirm, or just inside the edges of how the human mind tries to understand the unknown. And in that space, between those two possibilities, the theory continues, slowly, patiently, unresolved. Negative. The breakaway civilization, this theory, occupies a different register from most alien theories. It does not begin with lights in the sky. It does not begin with a single encounter. It begins, instead, with institutions, with systems, with the quiet accumulation of power over time. It is less about what extraterrestrials may have done, and more about what human beings may have done with something they were never meant to have, or perhaps were never meant to understand fully. The breakaway civilization theory suggests that at some point in the mid-20th century, most commonly placed in the 1940s or 50s, a small group within the United States military-industrial complex gained access to something extraordinary. Technology, material, knowledge. This access is often linked in different versions of the theory to events like Roswell, or to other less well-known incidents, recoveries that were not publicly acknowledged, findings that were classified immediately, and then moved quietly into programs that would not appear in any official record accessible to the public. From that point forward, the story changes direction. It becomes less about discovery and more about development. The idea is not simply that something was found, but that it was studied, reverse engineered, gradually understood, or at least partially understood, and then applied, used to build, to create, to extend technological capability beyond what was publicly known to exist. In this theory, the key factor is separation, a line drawn, not between nations, but within a nation, between what is publicly acknowledged and what is privately developed between the visible world and a hidden one. The group at the center of this theory is not always described in the same way. Sometimes it is framed as a division within the military, sometimes as a network of defense contractors, sometimes as a collaboration between intelligence agencies and private industry. But the defining feature is consistent. It operates with a level of secrecy that exceeds normal classification, not just hidden from the public, but compartmentalized, fragmented, such that even those working within the broader system may not be aware of its full scope. The phrase that often appears in this context is need to know. In its standard form, it limits knowledge to those whose roles require it. In this theory, that principle is extended to its extreme. So far, that entire programs can exist without broader oversight, without full accountability, without even the awareness of those who, in theory, sit at the highest levels of authority. The breakaway civilization in this framing is not announced. It is not declared. It emerges slowly, as capabilities accumulate, as technologies develop in isolation from public science, as knowledge is shared only within a closed circle. And over time, this circle becomes something distinct, something separate. A civilization not in the sense of geography, but in the sense of capability, of access, of understanding. One of the central ideas within this theory is that the technologies developed within this hidden structure would not resemble the technologies available to the public. not simply more advanced versions, but fundamentally different. Propulsion systems that do not rely on conventional fuel, energy systems that do not require traditional infrastructure, medical technologies that operate beyond current biological understanding. These ideas are often described in general terms, rarely with specific technical detail, which makes them difficult to evaluate, but also allows them to remain open. There is a practical dimension to this theory that is often emphasized: funding. Large-scale technological development requires resources, facilities, personnel, time. The suggestion here is that such resources could be drawn from what are known as black budget programs, classified funding streams within national defense budgets. These budgets are real. They have been documented. Their total scale is not always fully disclosed. Analysts have noted that significant sums are allocated each year to programs that are not publicly described in detail. This is not unusual. Military research often requires secrecy. But within the breakaway civilization theory, these budgets take on a different significance. They become the foundation of something larger, something sustained over decades. Another element that appears in many versions of this theory is the idea of continuity. Governments change, administrations come and go. Policies shift, but the program remains, because it is not tied to any single administration. It exists beneath that level, operating according to its own internal logic, its own priorities, its own timelines. The suggestion that successive presidents may have been denied access to certain information is one of the more striking aspects of this theory. It challenges a basic assumption that ultimate authority rests with elected leadership. In this framework, authority is more complex, more distributed, or perhaps more concentrated, but in places that are not visible, not accountable in the usual sense. Former Canadian Defence Minister Paul Hellyer is one of the most prominent public figures associated with this theory. He served in the 1960s, held significant responsibility, operated at a high level within a democratic government. In the later years of his life, he spoke openly about his belief that extraterrestrial presence on Earth was real, that multiple species had been visiting, and that elements within the United States government were aware of this, managing it, controlling the flow of information. Hellyer did not present physical evidence. His claims were based on information he had encountered, documents he had read, conversations he had been part of, or accounts he had chosen to trust. His background gave his statements weight, not proof, but attention. He was not easily dismissed as someone entirely outside the system. He had been inside it at a meaningful level, and that alone was enough to bring the theory into a wider conversation. Other figures from various military and intelligence backgrounds have made similar claims over the years, often cautiously, often indirectly, referring to programs they could not describe in detail, to technologies they suggested existed but could not demonstrate, to structures that operated beyond normal channels. These statements vary in credibility. Some are well documented, others are more ambiguous. But taken together, they contribute to a pattern, a sense that something may exist beyond the visible framework. Skeptics approach this theory from a different direction. They point out that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, that no verifiable documentation has been produced demonstrating the existence of a breakaway civilization, that, while black budgets are real, they are subject to at least some level of oversight, that large-scale technological programs, even highly classified ones, tend to leave traces in infrastructure, in personnel, in economic patterns, and that no such traces have been conclusively identified. There is also the question of complexity. Maintaining a secret of this scale over decades would require coordination across generations, across institutions, across changing political landscapes. It would require not only secrecy, but continuity of purpose, a shared understanding that persists without fragmentation. This is not impossible, but it is difficult, and difficulty in this context becomes a point of skepticism. And yet, there are elements of modern history that keep the question open. Classified programs have existed that were unknown to the public for years. Technologies have been developed in secrecy and revealed only after they were operational. The Manhattan Project, stealth aircraft, surveillance systems. Each of these existed at one time beyond public awareness and were later acknowledged. The difference, of course, is scale. The breakaway civilization theory extends far beyond any single program. It suggests not just secrecy, but separation. A divergence, a path taken by a small group that gradually moves away from the rest. There is also a philosophical dimension to this idea. If a group were to gain access to technology significantly beyond current understanding, what would happen? Would that knowledge be shared or contained? Would it be integrated into public systems? Or kept within controlled environments? Would it change society immediately or gradually, quietly? Over time, the theory suggests the latter, a slow divergence, so gradual that it does not disrupt. Until the gap between what is known publicly and what exists privately becomes very large. Some versions of this theory extend even further, suggesting that this breakaway group may have developed the capability for off-world travel, that it may operate beyond Earth, that it may have established a presence in locations that are not publicly acknowledged. These ideas move into a more speculative space, where evidence becomes even more limited and interpretation becomes more central. What remains consistent across all versions of the breakaway civilization theory is a shift in perspective, from looking outward to looking inward, from asking what might be visiting us, to asking what we might have become, or what a small part of us might have become. Without the rest knowing, it is a theory about separation, about knowledge, about control, about the possibility that the most significant changes in human capability may not be visible, may not be shared, may not even be recognized as existing. And as with the other theories we have explored, it does not arrive with a conclusion. It does not resolve itself. It remains as an idea, as a possibility, as a question about how power, secrecy, and knowledge interact over time. Perhaps nothing like this exists. Perhaps all advanced technology remains within the systems we can observe. Perhaps the world is exactly as it appears at the surface. Or perhaps there are layers, quiet ones, deep ones, operating without attention, without acknowledgement. And if such layers do exist, they would likely remain exactly as they are, hidden, not because they are impossible to find, but because they are designed not to be seen, which leaves the theory where it has always been, at a distance, difficult to confirm, difficult to dismiss, existing in the same quiet space as many of the questions we have followed tonight, a space where the known world ends, and something else, whether real or imagined, begins, negative intelligence. At the furthest edge of the alien theory landscape, the ground begins to feel less stable. The categories that have guided the conversation so far, spacecraft, visitors, technology, distance, begin to soften, and in their place, something more abstract begins to take shape. Some researchers and philosophers have proposed that the question of extraterrestrial intelligence may not be the right frame for understanding what is being encountered. Not wrong, exactly, but incomplete. Too narrow, too dependent on familiar ideas about distance and travel and physical presence. The suggestion here is quieter, and in some ways more difficult to hold. That at least some of what is described in UFO encounters and abduction accounts may not involve beings traveling from other star systems in physical craft, but rather some form of intelligence that operates outside or alongside the physical reality we normally experience, not arriving from far away, but already here, or perhaps not bound by the concept of here in the way we understand it. This idea does not reject the possibility of extraterrestrial life. It simply shifts the focus from space to perception, from distance to interaction, from movement through the universe to the possibility that the universe itself is not structured in the way we assume. One of the most prominent thinkers associated with this perspective is Jacques Vallée, a French-American computer scientist and astronomer, a researcher who began his work firmly within the scientific tradition, collecting data, analyzing reports, looking for patterns that could be explained within known frameworks. In the early stages of his career, Vallée approached UFO sightings as a problem that could be solved, something that could be categorized, explained, possibly even confirmed as evidence of extraterrestrial visitation. But over time, as he examined more cases, something began to feel inconsistent, not just unexplained, but internally contradictory. Objects that appeared solid would behave in ways that suggested they were not bound by physical constraints. Lights that seemed distant would suddenly be close. Encounters would leave psychological impressions that were as significant as any physical observation, and the details of these encounters would shift depending on the cultural context in which they occurred. This last point became central to Vallée's thinking. He noticed that the phenomenon did not present itself in a consistent form across history. Instead, it seemed to adapt, to reflect the expectations of the time. In ancient times, people reported encounters with angels, with demons, with gods descending from the sky, beings of light, beings of fire, messengers, observers, interveners. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, during the early industrial age, reports began to shift. People described mysterious airships, craft that resembled early human inventions, but more advanced, piloted by figures who were sometimes described as human-like, sometimes not, but always fitting in some way within the technological imagination of that era. Then, in the mid-20th century, as space travel became part of public consciousness, the form changed again. Now the encounters involved spacecraft, metallic discs, structured vehicles, piloted by beings that matched the emerging image of extraterrestrials. The pattern, to Vallée, suggested something unusual. Not that the phenomenon was evolving, but that it was presenting itself in ways that would be understood, recognizable, interpretable within the framework available to the observer. If this is true, it introduces a different kind of question. Not what is being seen, but how it is being seen, and why. Vallée proposed that the phenomenon behaves less like a physical visitation program, and more like a system of interaction, something that engages with human consciousness directly. Something that can appear physical, but is not limited to physicality, something that can leave traces, but does not depend on them. This leads to a possibility that is difficult to define clearly, that what is being encountered is not simply an external object, but an interface, a point of contact between human perception and something that exists beyond it. The word simulation sometimes enters the conversation here, not necessarily in the sense of a computer-generated reality, as it is often described in modern philosophy, but in a broader sense, a structured experience, a controlled presentation, an environment in which what is perceived is shaped, at least in part, by the observer. In this framework, reality itself becomes less fixed, less absolute, more participatory, something that can be influenced, or filtered, or adjusted. This does not mean that nothing is real. It means that what we experience as real may not be the full picture, that there may be layers, levels of description, levels of interaction, some of which we access, some of which we do not. Within this perspective, UFO encounters and abduction experiences are not necessarily physical journeys. They are events that occur at the boundary between perception and something beyond it. Experiences that feel physical, that feel real, but may not leave behind the kind of evidence we expect from physical events. This could explain certain patterns, why physical traces are rare, why encounters often involve altered states of awareness, why the details shift across cultures and time periods, why the phenomenon resists consistent measurement. It could also explain why attempts to study it using traditional scientific methods have been difficult. Science relies on repeatability, on consistency, on the ability to isolate variables. But if the phenomenon itself is responsive, adaptive, interactive, then it may not behave in ways that allow for controlled observation. Valère does not claim to know what this intelligence is. He does not define it as extraterrestrial, or interdimensional, or spiritual. He suggests only that forcing it into the category of beings from another planet may be choosing the most convenient explanation, rather than the most accurate one. Other thinkers have approached similar ideas from different directions, some from philosophy, some from physics, some from computer science. The simulation hypothesis, for example, proposes that reality itself may be a constructed environment, that what we perceive as the physical universe could be a kind of informational system. Within that framework, the idea of non-human intelligence becomes even more complex, because such intelligence would not need to travel through space. It could exist at the level of the system itself, operating within it, or alongside it, or beyond it. This idea can feel abstract, difficult to visualize, because it moves away from objects and into concepts, away from locations and into relationships. And yet, there is a certain consistency between this perspective and the patterns observed in the phenomenon. The adaptability, the ambiguity, the way encounters seem to blur the line between external event and internal experience. Some researchers have suggested that the phenomenon may act as a kind of mirror, reflecting aspects of human consciousness back to itself, shaping its presentation in ways that are meaningful to the observer, not necessarily to deceive, but to communicate, or to interact, in a way that can be received. Others have suggested that it may not be intentional at all, that it may be a byproduct of something larger, a system operating according to rules that we do not yet understand, occasionally intersecting with human awareness in ways that produce these experiences. There is also the possibility that multiple explanations are true at once. That what we call the UFO phenomenon is not a single thing, but a category containing different types of events, some physical, some psychological, some something else entirely. This idea that the phenomenon itself is genuinely strange in a way that our available frameworks cannot yet accommodate is, among serious researchers, one of the more compelling positions. And also one of the least satisfying, because it does not resolve, it does not conclude, it does not offer a clear answer. It leaves the question open, and not just open in a temporary sense, but open in a way that may persist. There is a quiet honesty in that, an acknowledgement that not everything fits neatly into the categories we have created, that some aspects of reality may remain partially understood, not because they are hidden, but because we do not yet have the tools to fully describe them. If there is a form of non-human intelligence interacting with us in this way, it may not be something we can point to, or measure directly, or isolate. It may be something that can only be experienced, not proven, and that places it in a different category entirely, closer to consciousness, closer to perception, closer to the parts of human experience that are real but not easily shared. It also raises a quieter question, not about what is out there, but about what we are, what consciousness is, how perception works, where the boundary lies between observer and observed, because if that boundary is not fixed, if it can be crossed, or influenced, or shared, then the nature of reality itself becomes less certain and more interesting. This is not a conclusion. It is not an answer. It is a direction, a way of thinking about a phenomenon that does not rely on distance or spacecraft or even physical presence. It suggests that whatever is being encountered may not be arriving. It may already be part of the system we exist within. And that idea, more than most, resists closure. It does not end. It does not settle. It simply remains quiet, persistent, just beyond the point where explanation becomes certainty. Negative? Of course, not everyone finds these theories convincing, and the skeptical perspective deserves the same careful attention we've given to everything else tonight. The Fermi paradox. The Italian physicist Enrico Fermi, while having lunch with colleagues at Los Alamos in 1950, reportedly gestured at the sky and asked a simple question: where is everybody? The logic behind the question is straightforward. The universe is approximately 13.8 billion years old. The Earth is only 4.5 billion years old. If intelligent life can develop on Earth in 4.5 billion years, there have been civilizations elsewhere in the universe with a head start of potentially billions of years. Even assuming that interstellar travel is difficult and slow, even assuming civilizations could only travel at a small fraction of the speed of light, a civilization with a 10 million year head start on humanity could have colonized the entire galaxy several times over by now. And yet, we see nothing. We hear nothing. No unambiguous signal from the stars. No megastructures visible in astronomical surveys. No contact. The Fermi paradox is a genuine intellectual problem. The solutions proposed for it range from the sobering, civilizations may routinely destroy themselves before reaching spacefaring capability, to the unsettling, perhaps we are in some kind of zoo or quarantine, to the genuinely strange, perhaps the silence itself is the answer. The paradox cuts in interesting ways against the alien conspiracy narrative. If extraterrestrial civilizations capable of interstellar travel exist, and if they are interested enough in Earth to be visiting it, the absence of any unambiguous signal or artifact in the broader universe becomes harder to explain, unless. Of course, the reason for the silence is something other than absence, the psychology of belief. Researchers studying the psychology of anomalous experience have found that the human mind is extraordinarily good at pattern recognition, and that this capability, which is deeply adaptive in most contexts, can generate meaningful seeming patterns in genuinely random or ambiguous data. This is sometimes called pareidoia in its visual form, the tendency to see faces in wood grain, clouds, or geological formations. But the same process operates across all sensory and cognitive domains. Studies of witness testimony, including testimony about UFO sightings, have found that memory is constructive rather than reproductive. We do not play back stored recordings. We rebuild memories each time we access them. And each rebuilding is influenced by subsequent information, emotional state, and the narrative frameworks available to us. Sleep paralysis, in particular, has been documented as a source of experiences that closely resemble abduction accounts. The inability to move, the sense of a presence in the room, sometimes visual hallucinations. Sleep paralysis is extremely common and often deeply frightening to those who experience it without understanding what is happening. None of this proves that nothing unusual is happening in the broader UFO phenomenon, but it provides a toolkit for understanding how genuinely unusual experiences can be reported, remembered, and interpreted in ways that may differ significantly from whatever actually occurred. The absence of confirmed physical evidence. Despite decades of investigation, no physical evidence of extraterrestrial origin has been publicly confirmed and independently verified. There are claims of recovered material, pieces of debris that researchers have described as anomalous in their composition. Some of these claims have come from credible seeming sources. None have yet been subjected to the kind of open, independent, peer-reviewed scientific analysis that would be required to establish non-terrestrial origin. The rocks brought back from the moon by the Apollo missions were analyzed by scientists around the world and confirmed to be consistent with lunar geological origin. No equivalent analysis has been completed for any claimed UFO debris. David Grush's congressional testimony, while extraordinary in its implications, was testimony about what others had told him rather than first-hand evidence. The physical material he implied was in government possession has not been produced. The absence of confirmed physical evidence does not mean nothing is there. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, particularly in a domain where material is claimed to be classified and concealed. But it means that the extraordinary claims in this field remain, by the standards of scientific confirmation, unconfirmed. The official acknowledgement gap. It is worth noting that the recent official acknowledgements of UAP as a genuine phenomenon, the Pentagon videos, the congressional hearings, the establishment of official investigation offices, have so far stopped well short of confirming extraterrestrial origin. The official position, stated by various defense and intelligence officials, is that some observed phenomena cannot be explained with currently available information, and that this constitutes a potential national security concern that deserves systematic investigation. That is a significant departure from decades of official dismissal. But it is not confirmation of aliens. It may be that the UAP phenomenon includes several distinct categories of explanation, some classified human technology, some atmospheric or natural phenomena, some observational error, and perhaps some genuinely anomalous cases whose explanation remains unknown. The unknown is not automatically extraterrestrial. It is simply unknown. We have walked a long way tonight, from Roswell in the summer of '47, through the decades of sighting reports and witness testimonies, through the strange geography of Area 51 and the Men in Black, and the congressional hearing rooms of the 21st century. We've spent time with the abductees and the ancient temples, and the philosophers who suggest that perhaps the frame itself is wrong, and now we arrive, as we always do, at the questions. Not the answered ones, the open ones. The first is the simplest, and in some ways the most profound. Is there life elsewhere in the universe? The scientific consensus, based on what is known about the distribution of planets, the chemistry of life, and the age of the cosmos, leans heavily toward yes. The sheer scale of the universe makes it statistically improbable that Earth is the only place where chemistry organized itself into something that could wonder about its own existence. But statistical improbability is not evidence. And the question of whether life exists elsewhere is entirely separate from the question of whether any such life has visited Earth, observed Earth, or knows that Earth exists. We do not know. We have not confirmed. The search continues. In radio telescope arrays, in the analysis of exoplanet atmospheres, in the ongoing study of Mars and the ocean moons of the outer solar system. The answer may come in our lifetimes. It may not come for centuries. It may already be hidden in data that hasn't yet been recognized. The second open question concerns the recent official shift in 2017, 2020, 2023, and in the years since the official posture of the United States government toward the UAP phenomenon changed in ways that would have seemed extraordinary even a decade earlier. Programs were acknowledged, videos were released, hearings were held, officials testified under oath. Why now? Several explanations have been offered. Some suggest that the declassification represents a genuine change in policy, that internal advocates finally succeeded in forcing the subject into the open. Some suggest it reflects concern about foreign technology, that China or Russia may be developing platforms that explain some UAP observations, and that public acknowledgement is a step toward building political will to address this. Some suggest it is a carefully managed partial disclosure, releasing enough to shift the conversation without releasing what is most sensitive. And some suggest that it is, in the most generous interpretation of the available evidence, the beginning of an answer to the question that has been sitting in the sky above us for as long as people have been looking up. The third open question is the one that sits underneath all of the others. Why does this subject matter so much to so many people? It would be easy to treat alien conspiracy theories as a fringe phenomenon, as the province of the credulous or the anxious or the eccentric. And some versions of these theories do belong to those categories. But the breadth and persistence of interest in this subject across every culture, every educational level, every political persuasion, suggests that something deeper is operating. We are a species that knows it is alone with its own consciousness, on a small planet in a very large universe. We know enough about what is out there to understand that we cannot possibly know very much about what is out there. And we are acutely aware, in a way that perhaps no previous generation was quite so clearly aware, of how small we are and how large everything else is. The question of whether we are alone is not just a scientific question, it is an existential one. It touches something very fundamental about what it means to be human, our need for context, for meaning, for some sense of where we fit in a universe that offers no obvious place for us. Whether the answer is that we are alone, or that we are observed, or that we are visited, or that we are created, each of those answers changes the story of what we are in ways that go far beyond any particular piece of evidence or any particular government document. And perhaps that is why these questions endure. Perhaps it is not primarily about the evidence. Perhaps it is about the asking. There is a question that researchers in this field sometimes pose at the end of conversations. When the data has been discussed, and the theories have been considered, and the counterpoints have been weighed, if we knew definitively, publicly, verifiably, that we were not alone, that intelligence exists elsewhere and knows we exist, what would change? Some people say everything. The way we relate to each other. The scale of what feels worth arguing about. The entire frame of human history. Others say not much. That Human beings are extraordinarily good at incorporating even the most radical information into a life that continues to need breakfast made and bills paid and children put to bed. Both answers feel, in their different ways, honest. Whatever is out there, the stars will still be overhead tonight. The universe will still be as large as it is, and we will still be exactly as small and exactly as remarkable as we have always been. Tonight we travelled through one of the oldest and largest questions human beings have ever asked. We started with a pilot over Mount Rainier and a rancher in New Mexico and a press release that said, "Flying disc for 24 hours before someone changed it." We walked through the famous cases and the strange ones. We sat with the people who have spent their lives investigating and the people who have spent their lives doubting, and the people who have had experiences they cannot explain and have carried those experiences for years. We heard the arguments on both sides and let them have their weight without needing to resolve them. And now it is late. The questions are still there, exactly where we left them. They are patient questions. They have been waiting for an answer for a very long time, and they have learned not to be in a hurry. You don't need to carry them with you into sleep. They will be waiting tomorrow and the day after that. There is something comforting, if you allow it to be, in the idea that the universe is so much larger than anything we are currently worried about, that somewhere out there, at distances so vast that light itself takes years, centuries, millennia to cross them, there may be other forms of awareness, other versions of consciousness, other kinds of life, doing whatever it is that life does. Or there may not be, and either answer is, in its own way, astonishing. You are here, you are aware, you are lying in the dark on a small, warm, living planet, orbiting a star that is one of hundreds of billions of stars, in a galaxy that is one of trillions of galaxies, in a universe that is 13.8 billion years old and still expanding. Whatever else is true tonight, that is true. And that is, all by itself, more extraordinary than any theory we covered this evening. The sky outside is full of unanswered questions, and tonight, that is enough to fall asleep to. Rest well.